Hi, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our workshop, and we may have a few more coming in, but we really appreciate all of you coming by today. I am Allison Smith. I'm a board member of both the League of Women Voters of Maine and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, and our collaboration, which we call Democracy Maine. We are all about empowering voters, defending democracy, and getting big money out of politics. Together, we work on a broad sweep of core democracy issues, as well as engage in traditional election-related voter service work, like registering voters, observing elections, and providing nonpartisan election information. We want this great experiment in self-governance to work, and that means good policy, good practice, and the greatest possible participation. At the League of Women Voters and Democracy Maine, we are staunchly nonpartisan and never support or oppose any candidate or political party. That being said, we are deeply political, and we don't hesitate to take sides on issues once we've studied them and come to agreement. The League has been around for more than 100 years, and membership is open to anyone who's at least 16 years old. Don't let our name scare you off. All genders are welcome. We know that our organization is strongest when it includes the widest possible array of folks in our communities. And to that end, we have adopted a pay-what-you-can membership dues structure. We hope you'll join us. Now, imagine being an American who resides in the United States, votes in every election, pays taxes, serves in the military, and shows up when called for jury duty, but has no voting representation in Congress. Imagine having no one to call or email when an important bill or a Supreme Court nomination is up for a vote. No one whose job it is to represent you and consider your views before casting a vote that may have a profound effect on your life. While this is unimaginable here in Maine, it's the unfortunate reality for the more than 700,000 Americans living in Washington, D.C. Now, in 2016, voters in DC did what Americans with a grievance have done since our very earliest days. They petitioned the government for redress. The result is the Washington, DC Admission Act, which passed in the House with the support, I'm proud to say, of both Representative Shelley Pingree and Representative Jared Golden. And it's now before the Senate. It's known as S-51 because it would make Washington the 51st state. Now, statehood would provide full representation in Congress, but it would also solve other problems that stem from DC's current status. While DC is treated exactly like a state for many purposes, Congress can and does interfere in important things like taxation, control of DC's local budget, its ability to make and enforce laws, provide protection in emergencies, and much more. Does Congress know better than elected officials and voters in DC? Of course not. But on the minimum wage, needle exchange programs, reproductive choice, gun control, and marriage equality, Congress has substituted its preferences for the expressed desires of DC residents. DC only gets what it wants if Congress, a legislative body with not one single voting member representing DC, agrees. DC residents lack representation, and they lack sovereignty, and their solution today is statehood. The problem isn't new, the solution isn't new, although other less comprehensive ideas have been pursued over the years. The trajectory of the debate in Congress is not new or unexpected. If this problem is to be solved, something needs to change, and that's where you and we all come in. Just as women, none of whom were decision makers in American democracy, spent most of a century in their righteous struggle to gain voting rights, DC residents who are hamstrung by their inability to directly determine the outcome of any legislative effort in Congress must make their appeal to those who can. That's us. The fight for DC statehood is an opportunity to stand with 700,000 fellow Americans and advocate for their full entry into American democracy, their full citizenship. If ever there was a moment that called for true committed allyship, this is it. Every one of us who values our own ability to participate fully in democracy, however imperfect and frustrating it often is, must help. I've been paying attention to DC voting rights since around 1998, when I was elected to serve on the board of the League of Women Voters of the United States. That same year, An organization called DC Vote was founded in order to serve as an educational and advocacy organization with a mission to secure full voting representation in the Congress for the residents of DC. DC Vote and the League of Women Voters have worked closely together ever since. And ever since my 2 years on the League's national board, I've just not been able to shake this issue. It just bothers me to my core. The blatant injustice of it, the obvious racism at its core, the absolute arrogance of Congress, the lack of help from the courts, the sheer outrageousness of allowing this status to continue. At a time when the freedom to vote and to be counted is the subject of much public debate and action in Congress, DC statehood, the clearest, least complicated example of disenfranchisement, remains poorly understood. It's trivialized by partisanship, and it's largely ignored outside of DC and the world of political activists. But I know, and research confirms, that many Americans just don't know much about the district's second-class status and are more likely to support voting rights when made aware of it. So I believe that the real fight is not in DC at all, but in the states. And our task is to raise up the striving of our fellow Americans in DC toward full enfranchisement and sovereignty. We need to do this in our communities and with our members of Congress, especially our senators. Today, I am delighted to introduce Patrice Snow, Communications Director for DC Vote. Patrice is going to share some important history to put today's fight for statehood in context, tell us about S51, and give the DC view on what all these injustices mean for people who live in the district. And we'll have time for questions too. Patrice is an expert on political and policy communications at the intersection of economics, race, and gender. Her work currently focuses on identifying and promoting opportunities in the media to advance the case of statehood for DC. But before joining DC Vote, she worked in the nonprofit and political worlds, including for former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick's Political Action Committee, Together Fund, and for a consumer advocacy organization called Allied Progress, and for Tom Steyer's presidential campaign too. Patrice, thank you for joining us. Let me turn the floor over to you.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for that introduction, Allison. First of all, I wanted to start off with a video that we have produced for our students for DC statehood, but I think anyone could take a look at it and learn about the facts of what it means for statehood. So Kate, take it away.
Can we see my screen?
Yes.
Are we good? Okay.
Washington, D.C. It's our nation's capital. Did you know that over 680,000 residents of the District of Columbia are disenfranchised because the nation's capital is considered a district and not a state? Did you know that the federal district is treated as if it were a state for hundreds of our nation's laws and has a larger population than Wyoming and Vermont? Did you know that an individual living in DC pays more in federal taxes per capita and fights in our nation's wars but is treated differently from every other person in every other state? It all began under the Articles of Confederation, when the federal government was incapable of governing over its own land, unable to protect itself against protesters, and struggled to find a permanent location for the nation's capital. Thus, the framers established the federal district through the ratification of the Constitution. It states that Congress has the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may, by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of the government of the United States. George Washington then chose land on the Potomac River in 1790 from Maryland to Virginia to form the federal district. Later, Virginia's portion was retroceded back in 1846 because it was not being used for the purposes of the federal government. The people of Washington, D.C. lack three things: voting equality, legislative and budget autonomy, and self-determination. D.C., like the territories, has no voting representation in Congress, and Congress can govern over the people of the District of Columbia in addition to having oversight over all its laws and budgets. D.C. has achieved several milestones in its fight towards self-determination in the past, including the right to vote in the Electoral College in 1961, the right to vote for a non-voting delegate in 1970, the right to vote for a mayor and a council in 1973, and the right to vote for a shadow congressional delegation in 1981. However, the residents of the district can only vote in the Electoral College unless there is a tie. The non-voting House delegate cannot vote on the House floor. The laws and budgets passed by the DC Council and signed by the mayor are subject to congressional oversight, and the statehood delegation cannot vote on the House or Senate floor either. In 2016, DC residents voted on a statehood advisory referendum, which was overwhelmingly favored by 86%. The referendum asked voters if they wanted to become the 51st state by shrinking the size of the federal district to preserve the intentions of the framers of the Constitution. Then, the remaining land and all citizens would be established as a new state to protect the identity of the people of the District of Columbia. The federal district, being maintained as the nation's capital, would encompass federal lands and buildings such as the White House, the Capitol Building, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Washington Monument. All other non-federal lands and citizens would be considered a new state. Welcome to the 51st state.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So that is where we are at. The history of Washington, D.C. and the history of statehood is a history that is basically all about, and I'm going to come out and say it is essentially all about race. I'm trying to pull up my notes and I cannot move my screen. Hold on one second. Having some technical difficulties. Uh-oh. How do I scroll over to my Google Notes? I thought I had it set up where I could scroll over and read my Google Notes and have you up on my Zoom meeting, but unfortunately it's not working for me.
I think you just need to click on that that icon so that you have that, and then you won't see your face, you'll see your page. But
let's see. There we go. Okay. So DC's fight for self-determination actually began with a fight for local governance. For DC residents lost their fight, the right to vote in federal elections in 1801, when Congress passed what they call the Organic Act, the District of Columbia Organic Act, which gave Congress the full control of district affairs. And until Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, DC residents could even vote in their local elections. After the Civil War was when America truly had a multiracial democracy, or at that time, I guess you could call it more of a biracial democracy, because it was essentially a black and white country. We had some Native Americans, but essentially at that time, the goal was the biracial democracy, and it worked for a minute. We had black senators from South Carolina, black senators from Mississippi, and DC was considered a mecca for free black slaves. And city leaders here even passed anti-discrimination legislation to support this new influx of population. This is when universities like Howard University in Washington, D.C. were formed, Hampton University, not too far away, Bowie State in Prince George's County in Maryland. And also, I currently live in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is in Montgomery County. But if you go down Georgia Avenue, which is the main drag from Silver Spring into the district, it's what they call the Gold Coast. And it's from Silver Spring to Howard University. And it's essentially the wealthiest African Americans per capita in the United States. And this formed right after the Civil War, during the biracial democracy that we're aiming for now. Of course, when one group of people get power, some other groups don't necessarily like that, and that would probably be considered a lot of the white conservatives and some white business leaders. They did not like the fact that certain groups of people were rising in status, economic and political power in the country. So there was a backlash to this right after Reconstruction. And because of the backlash, some of the business leaders in Washington, D.C. persuaded Congress to retreat from this biracial democracy that was working well. So from 1871 to about the 1970s, which happens to be when Black men were granted the right to vote around 1963, DC essentially lost its franchise to vote, which was principally due to race. It was a fear of Black political power that essentially led the repealing of the right to vote in Washington, DC. So the white establishment, the white leaders seeking to limit the power of Black voters, as well as poor white workers, which is also a story as well. Congress wanted to reduce the number of local elected positions in 1871 and instead expanded the number of presidential appointees. 3 years later, facing a system rife with debt and corruption, members of Congress blamed on ill-educated voters It eradicated DC's local elected government altogether in favor of a presidentially elected board. In fact, it was so bad in 1890, a United States senator from Alabama, a man by the name of Senator John Tyler Morgan, who was a Confederate Democrat and an enslaver himself, was asked why DC residents had lost the right to vote in even local election. He said, quote, "In the face of this influx of Negro population from the surrounding states, Congress found it necessary to disenfranchise every man in the District of Columbia, in order thereby to get rid of this load of Negro suffrage that was flooded in upon them. That is the true statement. History cannot be reversed. No man can understand it." And as Morgan later described it, Congress had to, quote unquote, burn the barn down to get rid of the rats being the Negro population and the barn being the government of the District of Columbia. That's a direct quote from a United States Senator. So a coalition was then formed with Black men and white labor leaders to at least restore suffrage to DC residents so they could at least vote in local elections. If they can't have representation in Congress, at least let them have power in local elections. But again, there was a lot of resistance within the white establishment and the white business community, particularly in the newspapers. If even in the Washington Post back in the 1890s, they did not want to have political power or Black political power here in the Capitol. Simply put, some wealthier white people simply preferred to have no voting rights for themselves rather than share a ballot box with large numbers of Black people who by then made up a third of the city's population. So in the early 1900s, white business and civic leaders pushed for some type of representation in Congress. It would avoid the potential Negro domination in the local city government, but it would give a say in Congress. But Congress itself wasn't having that. At that point, Congress and its committee system was controlled by notorious racists that managed to block any type of proposal given to DC home rule or congressional representation, all the way through the 1960s civil rights movement. So with backing from Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Congress did manage to push through the 23rd Amendment, giving DC residents 3 electors a vote for president in 1960. But congressional voting rights and home rule still flounder, mainly because of a famous segregationist from my home state of South Carolina, a congressman by the name of John McMillan, who led the DC committee in the House from 1945 until 1973. And it's funny, when he lost re-election in 1972, he blamed Black voters, and his direct quote was, "The colored people from DC were brought out." So he lost election in 1972. When the new Congress came in 1973, literally months into 1973, Congress passed the DC Home Rule Act of 1973, which restored democracy at the local level for the first time in 99 years. So DC residents could literally vote in local elections, but still could not have congressional representation. So we're making a little bit of progress here. In fact, and this was a bipartisan bill. Self-determination for DC was even a part of the Republican Party platform in 1976 when Gerald Ford was their presidential nominee. So this was something that both Republicans and Democrats agreed on. Well, this was also, I don't know if you're familiar with history, but this was the time of the rise of kind of what they call the New Right movement, the American Legislative Exchange Council, a young, good-looking governor by the name of Ronald Reagan, Pat Buchanan, those kind of folks were coming into town, and they were not going to have it. They were totally against DC self-determination. They didn't care about the arguments of taxation without representation. And so with the ascension of these kind of groups and these figures on the right, they were against Washington, DC's self-determination. But it's funny because Pat Buchanan wrote in an op-ed, and I tried to find it, but Pat Buchanan wrote in an op-ed that he wasn't opposed to DC self-determination on the basis of race. In fact, it was, quote, absolutely not about race. It was unconstitutional. And that's a lot of the arguments that the right, even now, likes to use, that Washington, D.C. statehood is unconstitutional, which is simply not true. The fact that D.C. is not a state affects so many issues. From abortion, for a bill to become law here in Washington, D.C., Congress has to approve it to a certain 30 to 60 day period, and members can kill a bill on the spot, regardless of constituent support or DC's ability to fund it or implement it, or what the DC mayor thinks or the council thinks. One member of Congress can kill members of Congress can kill the bill. Congress also has the ability to approve the DC budget. So how a city government spends revenue residents generate themselves, tax-paying citizens, Washington, DC residents are, I think on the list, are number 20 out of all the states, all of the 51 states in the nation. Washington, D.C. residents give more than they take. In fact, they produce more per capita than states like Kentucky, where Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is from, or South Carolina, where Senators Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott are from. Those are taker states. We are a giver state. And, statehood would change all of this. We would actually be in control of our own finances, and Congress would have no say. So we would solidify the DC population's place in discussions about social justice issues, including reproductive choice. One of the most disturbing infringements of federal power over DC's local finances in recent years was funding for abortion care. In 2011, congressional Republicans threatened to shut down the government until Democrats conceded to end public insurance funding for abortion in the district, playing the health care of thousands of low-income women as a leverage point in partisan politics. Gerald Hayes, president of the DC Abortion Action Fund, explained the provision's unpopularity in a statement saying, quote, DC residents overwhelmingly support abortion access, and the notion that the type of insurance you have should not dictate whether or not your insurance covers your healthcare needs, unquote. About a week and a half ago, a bill was brought to the floor by our delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, HR 1204, which would have allowed the DC City Council to set the salary for the new chief financial officer for the district. We're trying to recruit a new person, and we want to be able to raise the salary in order to be able to compete with both the private sector and the public sector. A simple bill that tax-paying citizens of DC would have paid for themselves. Congress would not allow the bill to go through. The House of Representatives, Republican members of the House of Representatives, along with some Democrats, would not allow the bill to go through. So we, as tax-paying citizens of the district, cannot determine how much we pay our chief financial officer, which is just insane. This person is paid for and sponsored by local taxpayer money. The bill's primary goal was to allow local officials, the city council, and our mayor, Muriel Bowser, to decide how much to pay the CFO, to determine the pay package, both the salary and the benefits. And Congress said no. But again, congressional interference is the story over and over and over with DC statehood. I don't see Congress, I don't see Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley telling the governors of Arizona or Maine or West Virginia what they should pay their government officials. So why are they doing it to Washington, DC? It doesn't make sense. It's a little bit of incongruent. Our vision, DC Vote's vision of DC statehood and how we see it going is the district council would become a state legislature with an addition of 8 other seats. So the chairman of the district council will become the leader of the state senate. The vice chairman will become the leader of the state house. We wouldn't have a state senate and state house. We would have a unicameral legislature, and we would be one of only 2 states with a unicameral legislature, the other one being Nebraska. The DC Constitution, our current iteration, calls for the assumption of the office of governor once the mayor becomes the governor. The chairman of the council again becomes the chairman of the legislature. And going back to the whole, I was a little nervous and hesitant when I was talking to Allison yesterday about talking about race and how it's really the underlying pinning of why Washington, D.C. isn't a state to this day. But the lack of DC statehood is essentially a walking, talking, breathing example of systemic racism. And the whole discussion that we had last year in 2020, when the George Floyd murder happened and the country was having this kind of racial reckoning, to me, it combines with that whole voting rights conversation that we're having as well. And this DC statehood is the perfect conversation with that. Congress, a white majority Congress, is essentially making decisions for a minority majority district. And that is plain and simple systemic racism. And also, if we were to get 2 senators, more than likely one of those 2 senators would probably be African-American. And I don't know someone's heart, but I'm thinking that someone like Mitch McConnell or Ted Cruz probably wouldn't like to have another African-American colleague in the Senate. I don't know, but that's probably what my gut tells me. But there are also a host of other issues that are going on here as well. It's the taxation without representation. DC is a professional city. We're not all politics all the time. We have veterans, we have doctors, we have lawyers, we have nurses, we have teachers. We have all types of professionals here who are paying taxes. Again, we are a state that is a giver and not a taker. and yet we're not being represented in Congress. We don't have any kind of voting rights in Congress. Our delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who would be an amazing governor, doesn't have any kind of say in what happens in the direction of our country. The second is self-determination. That's a big thing for Washington, D.C. and the residents of D.C. And it's a moral issue. It's an issue of voter suppression. You know, that's another conversation that this country is having right now with voting rights and racial reckoning, is that why do certain people's votes count more than others? And DC Statehood is a part of that conversation, and quite frankly, leading the conversation. Also, I wanted to mention too, in the video we showed where there was a vote in 2016 where 86% of DC residents wanted to become a state. And essentially the 4 pillars of becoming a state and the 4 questions that we have about becoming a state are the borders, the Constitution, the name, and the agreement to be a representative democracy. And those were all answered with that question on the ballot in 2016. We would be called I just went blank, but we know the name, what we wanted to be called. We would agree to be a representative democracy, meaning that we would have a representative that we would send to the House of Representatives, 2 senators. We would have a voting state legislature. We know our borders. We do not want to go back to Maryland. A lot of Republicans argue that, you know, we should become a part of Montgomery County, which is the county that borders Washington, D.C., or Prince George's County, another county that borders. But their culture is different. Their governance is different. Their mores are different. DC has a distinct culture all of its own, you know. So we should be able to have that kind of statehood and be able to celebrate that. And, you know, some argue on the other side that whenever states have entered into our union, it's always been a set of 2. When Hawaii entered, Alaska entered. But that's just not necessarily the case. That's not a rule or a law or part of the Constitution that 2 states have to enter together. So some people are saying, well, if Washington, D.C. enters, then Puerto Rico enters. And Puerto Rico, statehood is not as popular there as it is in Washington, D.C. So that's a straw man argument. It's a false argument. But if Washington, D.C. residents want it, if they're tax-paying citizens, why can't they have it? So one book I wanted to make sure that you all read, and a lot of the information where I got my information from, is called Chocolate City. And it's a book I would highly recommend. It's by 2 historians here in Washington, D.C. that really goes in depth and explains why Washington, D.C. isn't where it should be as far as a state, and how, you know, the history of from the Civil War to Reconstruction to that 100-year period between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement, which some would call Jim Crow, all the way through the Reagan movement and the Reagan Revolution, and how he really kind of rolled back a lot of the rights from Washington, D.C. And it's interesting. It's an interesting book that everyone should read and everyone should learn more about it. And I also encourage you to contact your senator. Senator Angus King is one of the few senators who's kind of been a little wobbly on the issue of Washington, D.C. statehood. And we're kind of trying to nail him down, along with Senators Kyrsten Sinema and Senators Joe Manchin. But Angus King is someone who we really want to be committed on the issue of statehood, and feel like it would not only benefit the citizens of Washington, D.C., but it would quite frankly benefit him, you know, strategically as a senator, and increase his power, political power here in Washington, D.C. So that is my presentation. I hope you all learned from it. I will be more than happy to take questions. Allison, I think you're on mute.
Patrice, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Kate and Lane, can you give me a hand here and say, are there any questions out there yet? If not, I will start with a couple of my own.
There are not currently questions.
Okay, so here's one that I've heard a lot. Patrice, why can't we count on the courts to get this, to right this wrong? I mean, isn't it just frankly unconstitutional to deny voting representation to people based on where they live? That just seems like something that courts would fix. So why have we not had luck in the courts?
Well, you would think that it would be ruled unconstitutional by the courts, but the courts have basically said it is up to the legislature to make a law to put DC statehood. That's what we've done for the 37 states that weren't the 13 original colonies. We've gone through the legislative process in order to enter new states into the union. And the courts have said it time and time again. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, they ruled that they are not going to touch DC statehood. And I think a second branch of that is probably that, you know, one of the few successes that former President Trump had was putting a lot of judges and justices on the bench that would probably not necessarily agree with DC statehood. So we don't want them ruling on it anyways. We would like to go through the legislative process in order to gain DC statehood.
Well, I also read a news article about a recent Supreme Court decision based, on this same topic, where I think the long and the short of that was that the Constitution reserves voting representation to people in the states, so that there's no constitutional right for DC residents to have voting representation because they are not residents of the state. So that seems like, okay, fair enough, but then it does seem pretty logical that the next step would be
to make it a state, right? Exactly. And if you want to take away their voting rights, if you want to take away the citizens of DC's voting rights, well, don't tax them. They pay no taxes. They can live in this area tax-free, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to not have members of Congress. But if you're taxing them, both on the local level and the federal level, then they need to have some type of say in the direction of their country and their leadership. So it's so illogical, and it so goes against the grain fundamentally of what a democracy should be.
We have a question from one of our participants. Have you seen a lot of support for DC statehood from citizens in other states?
That's what we're working on. That's what we're essentially trying to do. Our charge is to educate people outside of the Washington, D.C. area, because as we said, in 2016, 86% of DC residents voted for statehood. So we're going to places. My boss just got back from Phoenix, Arizona. And so we're doing a canvas in Phoenix, Arizona, so residents there can learn more about Washington, D.C. statehood and why it's so important in the larger picture of voting rights, so they can then speak to their senator, Kyrsten Sinema. Of course, Mark Kelly's our other senator, but Kyrsten Sinema is probably the most important one right now. But that's essentially what we're doing, is going out into the states so people can understand how this is so important. It's what we call a three-legged stool. The Freedom to Vote Act, which the Senate is voting on the procedural rule for the Freedom to Vote Act next week. Actually, Chuck Schumer just announced it. And then the John Lewis Advancement Act, and then DC statehood, which is S51. If we don't have those bills implemented and passed and signed by President Biden sooner rather than later, because oftentimes things don't get done during election years, it's going to be difficult even to hold on to our democracy. I don't know if you guys saw, Hillary Clinton was on The View earlier this week, and she basically gave a warning. And when Hillary speaks, I listen, because she tends to know a lot. And our democracy is truly at peril right now. And if anything, morally, yes, people should have voting rights here, and we should end voter suppression. And we all know that the underlying pinning of this issue is race. But if anything, if I'm a Democrat, I want 2 additional senators in the Senate to work with me so we can take away some of the power of Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, just strategically. So you would think that voting rights and S51, which is the statehood bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill would be the most important agenda item right now. But it's just not, I guess the constituents aren't rising up as they should be. So that's the charge, is essentially to educate folks and let them know how important this is in the bigger picture of democracy.
So thank you to the Maine Women's Summit organizers for recognizing that this would be a great forum for doing exactly that kind of outreach, to have the conversation in a wider circle. Patrice, you are a communications professional. And this topic was covered in your little video, but I know that this question of, it's unconstitutional, comes up over and over and over again. And one of the reasons people think it's unconstitutional is they have some idea that the Constitution says that the capital district is precisely not to be a state. So it says in the Constitution, there shall be a federal district, it's not a state. So your video did a great little explanation of how it would be carved out so that there still would be a federal district, only smaller, but there could still be a state. You're a communications professional. How do you answer that question when you're given it? What's your little brief elevator pitch that we can all learn from?
Sure, I just say we have the federal carve out, where we carve out all those monuments, the Washington, the Jefferson, the White House, the Capitol, and then everything around it would be the new Washington, D.C. That would be the state of Washington, D.C. I think that's the perfect way to say it. It's just the carve out, you know, and again, everything around it would be Washington, D.C. It's 700,000 residents who are tax-paying citizens who go to work every day, who deserve to have their rights heard and their voices heard in Congress. And they're currently not being heard. And it also goes to, you know, larger issues of the Senate being disproportionately representative of more rural areas than urban areas. So that counters that claim. We also get to have, again, 2 more senators, at least one of them being an African American. And the minute we become a state, Muriel Bowser, who is our current mayor, becomes governor. She becomes the first Black female governor in the country's history, which is pretty incredible as well. But sorry, I veered away from your question, but it's just, there's so many good talking points to have, you know, whether it's, you know, the racial determination issue, the self-determination issue, the moral issue, the voter suppression issue, the taxation without representation. It just depends on what type of audience you're speaking to. Obviously, if you're speaking to more, you know, conservative audiences or more business-oriented audiences, I think the whole taxation without representation will probably resonate with them a little bit more than anything else. You know, you're going to charge me money and you're going to tax me, but yet I don't have a say. But if you're speaking to a more diverse crowd, a younger crowd, I think racial reconciliation probably resonates more with them.
Thank you. We have a question. How much land does that carve out space encompass?
It's a small, I don't know the exact amount, but it's a small land. The Constitution says that the actual District of Columbia can't be more than 10 by 10. And so that area, and it's actually less than 10 by 10, because as you saw in the video, that Virginia took back some of its land. But that small carve out, it's incredibly small, and it's not particularly residential. There are not a whole lot of people that live in you know, near the Capitol or near any of the monuments or the White House. It's more of a business area.
So the idea is that the residential and most of the commercial areas would be part of the state of Washington Douglas Commonwealth.
That's right, Douglas Commonwealth. I'm sorry.
And then the District of Columbia would be the federal district encompassing the non-residential, non-commercial.
That's right.
Areas. Great. Terrific. If you've got more questions, post them. In the meantime, I've got another one here. Let's see. Some people think there is a conflict with the 23rd Amendment, which, as you pointed out, granted DC electors in presidential elections. And this is because if DC becomes a state, it will have its own electors based on the fact that it's a state. So is that a conflict? How would it be resolved? You know, I've heard people talk about like, this is just unresolvable, but it seems like.
Yeah, that's not true. I'm not a constitutional scholar, and I've actually asked an old professor about this and he hasn't gotten back to me. But there is a way to resolve the 23rd Amendment question because it is a legitimate question. You know, the 23rd Amendment was passed, which gave DC 3 electors in the presidential race. But there is a way to resolve it in Washington Douglas Commonwealth versus the district, you know, when DC finally becomes a state. So that is not anything that that is something that can be resolved with legislation easily.
I also am not a lawyer or a legal scholar, but even I can see that that's a bogus argument because any law that's made can be undone. So if we just got rid of that law that implements the 23rd Amendment, then those additional electors would be gone. You repeal the law. Or I've heard also that I think it was President Biden who put forth the idea of why don't we just assign those 23rd Amendment electors to whoever won the popular vote. So it's sort of give a boost to the popular vote winner since looks like we may be stuck with the Electoral College for a little while longer.
Right. And I will say President Biden, when he was in the Senate especially, has been a huge advocate for DC statehood. He has always supported DC statehood. He has gone the full mile. It's not just, local elections. He believes in congressional representation, a governor, a unicameral legislature. He's always supported it. And his former Delaware colleague, Senator Tom Carper, is carrying the water for DC statehood in the Senate right now. They are huge supporters of it. So, you know, if we can get it through the Senate, we can get it through the House, we are certain President Biden would sign it. But the challenge right now, with every other piece of legislation, is just getting it through the Senate without the filibuster.
Right. Or with the filibuster.
Filibuster, rather, yes.
So I am sorry, I misread the earlier questions. So our questioner, Kartika Wright, when she was asking about how big the district would be, what she meant was the new state. How much space would that encompass? And I think the answer is still the same, right? Still, it would be under 10 square miles because it's a smaller part of what is there today.
Right. The Constitution does say the District of Columbia can only be 10 by 10, 10 square miles by 10 square miles. And then you have the Virginia that took that out in the 19th century. And then you'll have the federal carve out of all the monuments. So everything around that federal carve out would be Washington, Douglas Commonwealth.
Okay, so it would be quite a bit bigger than the federal district, but it would be smaller than the current.
That's right.
Columbia.
But it would still have a larger population than Wyoming and Vermont. I mean, that's the incredible thing about it. Yet, land-wise, it would be especially small, but it still has a larger population than Wyoming and Vermont, and still pays more taxes than 30 other states per capita.
Yeah. And some of the things that members of Congress have pointed out as this issue has been debated in this Congress have been, so, I mean, to my ears, bizarre, but all the reasons why DC can't be a state, I mean, you've probably got a long list, Patrice, that come like no car dealerships. What?
Right.
You need car dealerships to be a state, all sorts of, I can't remember some of the more bizarre things, but. And
it tells you what they know, because there are plenty of car dealerships in Washington, D.C. So I wasn't working for DC Vote at the time, but I was told when that happened, a lot of the DC statehood activists went to the Tesla dealership in downtown DC and took pictures with their DC signs in front of the Tesla dealership. There are plenty of car dealerships. There are plenty of movie theaters and homes and everything that they would require, which seems rather arbitrary, but everything they think that they need to see in order for an area to become a state. So I don't know who's been to DC, but there's a culture here, a strong go-go culture. As I said, I live in Silver Spring, Maryland in Montgomery County, but when I'm driving from Silver Spring to Washington, DC on Georgia Avenue, which is a famous avenue here in Washington, it's the largest, the wealthiest wealthiest neighborhood of African Americans probably in the history of the United States. I mean, per capita, you have what they call the Gold Coast, so there's that culture and Howard University's culture. And it's just a very, it's a different place, but it's a beautiful place. The people are beautiful, and it's so much more than just politics. It's, people think that it's all politics all the time, but there's that DC, which is, the District of Columbia, but there's also Washington, which is a strong history and of African Americans doing well here, and a lot of free slaves coming here and prospering here and having a strong Black middle class. So, and people think it's they call it Chocolate City, like the book I recommended, Chocolate City, but it's actually funny because the demographics are actually reversing a little bit now, that DC is becoming such an expensive place to live that a lot of working class Blacks are actually moving to Prince George's County in Maryland. And the more DC gentrifies, the more expensive it becomes. It's becoming a city of more white, college educated younger people. So maybe if that happens, maybe some folks would be more open to Washington, DC becoming a state, but I doubt that too, because a lot of those folks probably aren't going to vote the way that they would like them to vote.
And wouldn't that be just a sad and pathetic reason to finally get statehood? But I guess we'll take what we get. So there's a question here, a more personal question, Patrice. You said that you were from South Carolina. One of our participants, Cassis, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name right. I hope that's close. You said that you're from South Carolina. I'd love to hear about your professional and personal background on why you got involved in this movement.
Sure. Well, I was born in South Carolina. I did my undergrad down there at a school called Columbia College, which is an all-women's college in South Carolina. And I kind of fell in love with politics there. It's just, South Carolina is a Republican state, but it's still an interesting state for politics, to say the least. If they say if you want to get a graduate degree in politics, one of the states you go to is South Carolina. So I fell in love with politics, worked on some campaigns while I was in undergrad, but I always knew I wanted to come to Washington, D.C. I visited D.C. in like the high school, class trip and really enjoyed it. So I always knew I wanted to come back here. And came back up here, worked on Capitol Hill, went to grad school at Georgetown. And I got out of politics for a little bit. I did some private sector stuff. I'm not sure if I wanted to commit my life to this, but then, Trump got elected and I kind of figured out this is what I wanted to do. And this is what I wanted to dedicate myself to. So after 2016, I worked on consumer advocacy work for US PIRG, the Public Interest Research Group in Washington, D.C., and really enjoyed it. I found it to be really like DC statehood. It was really a way to merge kind of economics and racial issues and gender issues all together without just talking about race all the time or gender all the time. But when you're talking about equal opportunity and fair play and how kind of consumer work disproportionately helps women. I enjoyed it. I really, really liked it a lot. Then I worked for a group called Allied Progress, which I did consumer advocacy work for them as well. And Allied Progress is a little bit different from PIRG. PIRG issues a lot of reports, whereas Allied Progress, we were going for the Trump appointees who we knew were doing things that were just not ethical or even, quite frankly, legal. We were protecting the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from Mick Mulvaney. It was Elizabeth Warren's baby, so we wanted to protect it. We were going after Betsy DeVos, Trump's education secretary, who was doing some stuff in the student loan space that just was not kosher. And did that and got a phone call from a headhunter asking if I wanted to work for the Tom Steyer campaign. And I had never done a presidential campaign before. So I was like, why not? Tom Steyer, I've heard great things about him. I knew climate was his big issue. So I worked on Tom's campaign and I really, really enjoyed it. I got to know him and his wife, Kat, and I enjoyed it. I knew South Carolina was going to be a pivotal state so I could go back home and spend some time with my family. So I worked on Tom's campaign, and then Tom's senior advisor was also Deval Patrick's senior advisor. So when Tom dropped out of the race, a man named Doug Rubin asked if I wanted to come work for Deval Patrick. And I said yes. You don't say no to Deval Patrick. And I knew that he wanted to be seriously considered for a role in then candidate Biden's cabinet. So I knew that was kind of the mission and the goal. So I worked for his PAC for about 10 months from March till February, in the middle of COVID, in the middle of George Floyd, to be getting to work for Deval Patrick, of all people, was a once in a lifetime experience. I mean, I didn't know this at the time, but he was the head of the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ during the Clinton years. So he had a lot to say about police reform and the George Floyd's murder and racial reconciliation. And even talking about when he ran for governor of Massachusetts, as a Black man, there were certain things that he could say that or he couldn't say that I can say simply because of our generational differences. He was very honest. He was like, I knew if I wanted to be successful and be elected to governor of Massachusetts, which is not an easy state for a Black man to run in, that there were certain things that I couldn't say. So just being able to hear his kind of war stories and he's so funny. He'll drop names. He's not bragging, but he'll say, well, Barack read this and he thought this. And, so to be able to learn from him at his feet was just, during 2020, was just amazing. So when he decided to lay us off from that PAC, DC Vote came along. A friend of mine who I worked with in the Tom Steyer campaign, a woman by the name of Lauren Windsor, who's making these amazing videos right now. She's actually going around to Republican rallies and speaking to Republican candidates and getting them on tape saying things that they should not be saying. But she asked if I wanted to come work for DC Vote because it was a partner organization of hers. And I interviewed and I met Bo and Barbara, my colleagues, and fell in love with it. I knew these are my people. So, and again, this is a issue that kind of melds everything that I enjoy talking about. I like talking about kind of democracy issues. I like talking about racial reconciliation issues. I like talking about, again, fair play and justice and equity. And DC statehood is a big part of that. And it's on the front lines, and it's something that needs to be spoken about more. It kind of gets brushed to the side right now. And we're trying to make sure that people talk about it a little bit more when they talk about the Freedom to Vote Act, when they talk about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But I really, really enjoy it. This was my first big presentation, by the way. So I just want to put that out there.
We're happy to be your guinea pigs here. A follow-up question from our same participant. Do you think that DC statehood would combat the gentrification of the area?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably not. Probably not. I mean, this area is so, it's growing, and it has its own urban issues that a lot of the major cities are having, that a lot of folks, more working class people, just can't afford to live here. So they're having to move to further out. And a lot of younger folks, more college educated folks, are moving into the cities. So I don't see how statehood would affect that. I think for me, one of the reasons I decided to move to Maryland is because I do have my own political ambitions and goals, and I knew I could become a lieutenant governor or governor here before I could in Washington, D.C. So if D.C. were to get statehood, I would be more incentivized to move back to Washington, D.C. than to stay in Maryland. So I don't see how statehood would affect that.
Also, you'd have voting representation in Congress if that. So
Exactly.
another good reason to move back. It is a good question, though, and I thank you for asking it, because I said in my remarks that DC is treated just like a state in many, many ways. But it doesn't, not always. And I read I don't understand it well enough to explain it, but somehow DC got shortchanged with COVID funds because it was not treated as a state. So, it may be that there would be that people who are not high income people who live in DC may be better off if DC becomes a state. I think
that could be true. In fact, I read a story in, like you said, in Ben's Chili Bowl, which is an institution here in Washington, D.C. It's a Black-owned business that serves essentially kind of designer hot dogs, half smokes or what they call them. And they weren't able to get all of the PPP money that they could have gotten because of the kind of status of Washington, D.C. as being a district rather than a state. And they almost went out of business. I don't remember what saved them. Maybe they ended up getting the PPP money at the last minute, or some people were crowdfunding, but they almost went out of business because they weren't able to access PPP money and in any of the money in the CARES Act, which was passed when COVID originally hit. So that is an issue where lower income people could probably access funds or have access to funds quicker when we do have national emergencies like COVID.
Yeah, I was wondering about the money, because you were talking about, the being told no in Congress that you couldn't fund your own CFO, which is ridiculous. And so I'm wondering, it's almost as if the district is caught between being neither here nor there, not a state or not under really federal program. So how does it work? You have to fund all of your own supports, emergency personnel, education. In Maine, it's an interesting thing, depending upon the governor, whether we accept federal funds or not. We have an issue right now with our tribes and their issues of sovereignty that are going on. Because the tribes are not federally recognized and so cannot get funds that could help them. So I'm just wondering if you would speak about the district's kind of money stuff, like how you cope.
It actually happened a couple of years ago when the Congress made the district and district residents accept a voucher program that not everyone was in favor of, but Congress made the mayor and district residents accept a voucher program for their public school systems. They made them accept a voucher program here and install a charter school system here. Now, granted, this is off the record. It's actually pretty popular here. They've actually done a really good job with it. But again, to have a white majority Congress tell a minority majority city or district what they can and cannot do with their public funds in order to fund schooling for their children, it's incongruent with everything the United States says that it wants to be. But that happens quite a bit. Again, like I said earlier, with the abortion money, with the CFO money, with the CARES Act money, Congress has the ability to put a brake on anything they want to put a brake on. And that's not how a representative democracy should work. A tax-paying citizen should have a say about where their money goes.
And how? Great. So I think we are, we're almost at 4:15 and we're scheduled to finish at 4:30. So unless there's another burning question, I thought we would wrap up with some next steps. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Well, I encourage everyone to visit our website, dcvote.org. That's dcvote.org. Also contact your senators, particularly Senator Angus King, and write them, call them, email them, let them know how important DC statehood is, not only to the residents of DC, but to the larger democracy conversation about where this country is going, about how we feel about voter suppression and self-determination and racial reconciliation. Also, we are going to be doing next week, the residents of West Virginia, Maryland, Virginia, and DC are going to be having a relay and rally. We're going to start our relay in West Virginia for obvious reasons to make sure Senator Joe Manchin hears our voices. And we're going to ride all the way through Maryland and Virginia through Glen Echo Park, which is a park that was integrated by Howard University students, all the way to Raleigh to Washington, DC, to let our senators know that we support Washington, DC statehood. We support them voting for the Freedom to Vote Act next week. We support them supporting the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We're going to have a party next Friday night at Ben's Chili Bowl, the restaurant I was mentioning earlier, and just let folks know that DC statehood is a part of the democracy conversation. And oftentimes it's left out, but it should be included because it is so important in order to preserve our democracy, which is, it's teetering right now. So we encourage you to get involved. We're not the only organization out there. We think we're the best, but there are other organizations as well. There's an organization called 51 for 51 that does a lot of work with DC statehood and filibuster work as well. There are books to be read. Again, the book I recommended earlier, Chocolate City, by two historians here in Washington, DC, which really goes in depth about the history of Washington, DC statehood and why it's where we're at, which is, again, essentially racism or systemic racism. And again, call Senator King. That's someone that we're really trying to target right now. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for allowing me to be a guinea pig, because this is my first big presentation and I was very, very nervous. So I appreciate it.
Well, that's great.
You did great.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's terrific. We were really very appreciative. So we're all going to call Senators Collins and King, right? Everybody's going to pledge to do that. That's awesome. I think Lane Sturdivant, my colleague, is going to post a helpful link in the chat to make that easy. You could even do it right now. The second thing I wanted people to think about is think about your own community, your friends, your family, your book groups, your faith community, your Rotary Club. Who would be interested in this, and what would be the best way to put this issue in front of potential allies who might not know much about it? The book that Patrice suggested, Chocolate City, was co-written by Colby professor Chris Myers-Ash. He wrote a terrific op-ed called Let My Mother Vote in one of the local papers earlier this year. He's been a great voice on DC statehood, and he's right here in Maine. Part of the blurb from that book is, monumental in scope and vividly detailed, Chocolate City tells the tumultuous 4-century story of race and democracy in our nation's capital. It won a Best History book in 2017. And if that doesn't make you want to read it, I don't know what would. It sounds terrific. Also, Lane is going to post a link to the League of Women Voters of DC's resource page. They have films, fact sheets, a lot more very easy to digest information if you want help talking about some of these aspects of the issue. And finally, I want to share my email address, which Lane is going to be good enough to put in the chat also, so that you don't have my typos, meaning that your well-meaning email will go somewhere else. We may win S51 this year, or we may be in for a few more rounds. You know, my crystal ball is clear and is cloudy. And either way, we welcome you in whatever effort you're willing to devote to the cause. And I hope that if we need to be here for the long term, that you'll stick with it for the long term. So please contact me directly if you want to, really be under the hood of this and on this main effort. And if you have any particular helpful insights in getting a meeting with Senator King, or have influence with the people who influence Senator King, like that would be helpful to know. It would be good to have a strategy to be successful. I mean, I've written to Senator King again and again about this, and I try to implore that these are issues that need a different dynamic in order to break out of the partisan straitjacket they're in. As long as Republicans get away with saying, oh, Democrats just want 2 more Democratic senators, that's just a way of fundamentally trivializing a basic fundamental democracy issue that's just not right. And so, but how we launch that out of the partisan divide is through a strong, independent, well-respected, articulate voice. Who better to fill that role than Senator King? Anyway, I will conclude with a few words, and my thanks to the Maine Women's Summit and to Patrice Snow and everybody who helped. Kate, Lane, thank you so much for your support. The call for statehood is a call for self-determination, and it's one that we all must heed. If democracy is to work for all of us, it must include all of us. And that means full enfranchisement and local sovereignty for Washington, D.C. When it comes to civil rights, the solution can't be to split the difference, compromise the rights that are at stake, or wait for some perfect time, which is never going to arrive. Our Constitution calls for equal protection under the law, and this promise remains unfulfilled as long as these injustices continue. Justice delayed is justice denied, and let's do everything we can to right this wrong in our lifetimes. So with that, if anybody else have final thoughts before we've got a few more minutes, if anybody has anything to share, any questions.
Also, I should share my email address. It's psnow@dcvote.org. That's psnow@dcvote.org. If you want to get involved, or if you need any additional resources or any additional questions that I would be more than happy to answer, or I would refer you to someone who would know the answers. So
great. Just a thought for folks who remain on there. I think we've got about 9 of us or so on this call. Can anybody offhand think about a group they're part of that might want, an informal presentation or a more formal presentation, either in person or via Zoom? Is this something that might be of interest to anybody? Okay, not right away, it looks like.
Well, I know in my faith group, we're looking into racial justice right now, and this certainly falls smack into that aspect of education. And we do have, Europe is very interested in aspects and issues of voter suppression. So I'm going to share all of this information with them, the links, and if I could, your name, Patrice, and to bring this as an issue, and Chocolate City. And so that will be going out to, a number of people, and here in Yarmouth, Maine.
Thank you, Dale. That's terrific. That's exactly the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that is going to, break this into a bigger conversation in states around the country. So thank you for that. Think about it, folks, and think about, the arenas in which you circulate, and if you have a book group, if you've got a faith community, if you belong to any sort of a club at all, whether, this would be an appropriate topic. We'd love to help.
I'm sorry, Kosis came off mute.
Yeah, it's Kosi. And first of all, I would like to say thank you, Patrice, so much for all of your words. Just, hearing about this issue from another Black person is really, really helps me digest it more and just appreciate it more. And especially since you also live in Silver Springs, which is actually where I was born. And I spent a little bit of my childhood. So I definitely feel kinship to you. And also I work with this organization called Just Me for Just Us, which pretty much tries to um, create political power within rural, its main mission is to create political power within rural counties in the state of Maine. And my job is specifically focused in Penobscot County. And I would love to maybe have some type of training just looking at this issue of DC statehood and seeing what some youth in this area might think of this issue as well. So I would definitely love to be in contact with you.
Sure. Like I said, email me at psnow@dcvote.org. I would love to. Like I said, this was my first presentation, so the more I do it, I think the better I'll get. But I would love to help, honestly.
Thank you, Kosi, for correcting me on your name. I appreciate that. And I appreciate knowing that there is rural organizing happening because I live in the very far northern part of the state. And I'm thinking that it would be, there's in our part of the state, there tends to be people who are very interested. And Zoom has been, it's about the only good thing of COVID at the moment. So if there is any ability to do presentations via Zoom, Allison and Patrice, I can almost guarantee you we can get folks in Aroostook County.
Awesome.
I would love it.
Terrific. One last fun fact I read when I was poking around the DC Vote resources, they did some interesting polling. And, a lot of people don't know much about it. And the summary of the poll shows, who's more likely to support it, who's less likely to support it. But an interesting division was that men were more likely to support it, but that wasn't because women were less likely. It was because more women didn't know much about it. So there's a real, if you think about that, there's just a bigger learning opportunity among our women in our various cohorts. So something to keep in mind that even though, that when people learn about this issue, they come on board. And the opportunities for people to learn and come on board are greater among women. So something to keep in mind. And I think the youth of today have such a strong sense of right and wrong and justice and injustice that there's got to be a ton of opportunity there. I know Patrice told me she recently presented at American University, and I'll bet there was a lot of just jaws on the ground that this situation exists in this day and age.
They have a DC Statehood chapter at American University. They're helping us next weekend for our relay to rally from West Virginia to DC. Folks at American University are actually helping us. So,
Terrific.
yeah.
Yeah.